welcome back to episode 15 of Turn Bark Time. I'm the Turn.
I'm Bark.
And just before this, we have decided to rename our later segments in the week. These are our Turn Bark Time shenanigans. This is our midweek shenanigans piece. So we're going to talk about some shenanigans. So one of the big things that's popped up a lot in the news lately has been these COVID protests over executive orders issued by governors, stay-at-home orders, and people saying that they are unconstitutional and things like that. So what we're actually going to do is we're going to break down the system of, who has the authority in this scenario, because a lot of people turn to the federal government and think the federal government should run it. The federal government has said the states should run it, but now the federal government's saying the states aren't doing it right. And then you have local people who are saying, well, the state government's not figuring it out, the local government's got it. So we're going to try and sift through all of these shenanigans.
So if you come with us to the Constitutional Library in our fictitious area that we really inhabit on the interweb, I watched another video today that explained federalism like a layer cake, and I thought that was just intellectually delicious. So, you imagine that, this nice blueberry flavor here is the federal government at the top, and then you have the states, whoop, and then at the bottom, you have your local governments, either your counties or your cities. So federalism just means that there is a sharing of power between, it generally means the federal government, which this is my symbol when we did the Bill of Rights, or the Bill of Rights hand signals for the 10th Amendment, power to the federal government, top of the pyramid, not the Illuminati, but yeah, I know. But then it's pushed to the states at the bottom. And so it's become very apparent with our COVID response that President Trump is putting a lot of the impetus on how things are going to be handled by giving the control to the governors. Jay Inslee's he's streaming at like 2:30, just about well, he says 2:30, but he's really not on until about 3 o'clock because, that's government officials. People are like, shouldn't they be more professional? And I'm like, have you ever sat and watched CNN when they said the president will speak at 5 o'clock, and then at 5 o'clock you sit there for 20 minutes?
Yep.
So it's a government thing.
Yeah.
The only government people that show up and operate on time are teachers.
Shout
out. Shameless promotion.
Yep.
But the other thing is coming about is that there's been arguments in the past about, do states have the right? It was something called nullification. A guy named Thomas Jefferson thought of it. Another guy named James Madison, just random people, you may have heard of them. But they came up with these two ideas, especially it was with the Alien and Sedition Act. We talked about a few episodes ago, but they were talking, they said states should have the right to decide if things are, it feels like it's been a couple days. It's been a long month this week.
Yep.
But anyway, they said that states should have the right to nullify laws that the states feel are unconstitutional. And what we're seeing is kind of an application of federalism inside of states now, where when Jay Inslee was saying, people were saying, let us fish, here we got protests, right? Open it up. I need a haircut. I want to go fish. I want to go hike. Some of that we're going to get to do next week. But I think was it Franklin County down in Tri-Cities?
Yeah, Franklin County was one of the counties.
Initially came out and said, we're not going to enforce the stay-at-homes or the stay safe, stay home. And then they kind of walked that back. But then you had like Douglas County and Chelan County that were allowing residential construction to happen, which was against the guidelines of the state. And they were essentially saying, so like states say, we know our people better because the people in our state can talk to the state government easier than they can talk to people in Washington, D.C.
And a lot of that has to do with like power, right? Like when we talk about we talked about the Electoral College in an earlier episode, in which we discussed, right? Like, so my vote for president is a lot less impactful than my vote for governor, right? But then people would also make the argument that my vote for my county commissioner is more impactful than my vote for state governor, right? My county commissioner should know who I am better than the state governor who knows me better than the president of the United States.
And so the argument's becoming is and this came out too with the passage of the gun bill last year, where Washington became one of the most stringent kind of gun law. Had some of the most stringent gun laws in the United States, and you had sheriffs from all over I think there's 39 counties in Washington.
38 is what I want to say, but I could be wrong.
But I think 32 of the sheriffs came out and said that they wouldn't enforce it. They weren't gonna actively go out and take away people's guns, which is what people always get all their feathers ruffled about. And so it kind of became this idea of, does a sheriff have the right to interpret the Constitution and tell the state government, I don't believe that law is legal and I'm not going to follow it, which is an idea called it's a principle called interposition, which actually, when you look up a lot of interposition stuff, it comes up to what are called constitutional sheriffs, which tend to be people who have a very strict constructionalist view of the Constitution that, I don't know, in my opinion, kind of ignores the last 200 years of legal precedent. Isn't very likely to win in court.
Right. And so what we're talking about here is it's we have these people that say they know their people best. And so again, federalism, the concept of federalism, of that sharing power, and we call it enumerated powers for the federal government, and then we had concurrent powers, so powers that both. So enumerated powers would be things like only the federal government, so they can only coin money, declare war, raise an army, things like that, right? Then we have concurrent powers, which shared, so both the state and the federal government can tax us, right? They both can work on transportation. They both can, they can do things together. And then you have what we call reserved powers, which are powers just set for the states. And again, not local, right? That's kind of where we're getting to. So the reserved powers would be things like education, right? Every state can mandate their own education. So what we're looking at is, does that federalism now play at the state government, right, where it goes down to the local, right? Because people would say again, right? And to understand this, we can look at it from two states of opinion, because we have two major political parties in our country and they view the government differently. So if you are a liberal or tend to lean liberal, you want the government to be involved and take steps to protect people and help people and do those things. If you are conservative, you want less government, you can handle your own things. It's that pull yourself up by your bootstraps mentality. And so what we have here, though, is where this is what we got on the topic of when we were discussing this off camera, was that you have a conservative president, right? President Trump ran as a Republican, a conservative. And so his thing is, I'm going to push the power to run COVID response to the states, right? And one thing that Barker and I kind of agree on, and again, our opinion, we want to stress that a lot of this stuff is our opinion, is that the federal government, if they do push that stuff to the states, they need to help with anything the states need. That's kind of their job. And so obviously, when you look at governors asking for supplies and the federal government's no, you got to handle that, right? It can cause some major issues, right? Congress is supposed to handle all interstate commerce. And I would say that if this went to court, it might hold in the Commerce Clause, the federal government being a little bit involved. It might, just off a couple legal precedents. But now you hand this down to a liberal governor, right? So Jay Inslee, liberal, Democrat, and he thinks that the government should be involved in people's lives. So he makes this emergency order and he says, you got to stay home and we're closing all these businesses and everything like that, 6 feet apart and all this stuff. But then, so he does what he thinks is best, what the people elected him to do. And then you have a Franklin County sheriff, which again, right, the people elected him, he got elected. So he's kind of looking at this saying, okay, in my opinion, this is too much, so I'm going to run in my county how I want to run. I'm going to take my law enforcement and use them how I feel they need to be used. And so one of the big issues was Jay Inslee was actually asked at a press conference if he was going to use the state patrol, which is technically the state police, to go to Franklin County and enforce these laws. And he did not say he would. He said, I just hope they come around to reason. And Franklin County did back off, right? They did back up. And it was the same thing with Douglas and Chelan counties with the residential construction. Inslee was like, I'm just disappointed. Like, I want them to realize the importance of what I'm doing here. And they backed off as well. And so when you look at this, right, like this is the big overarching question is who actually gets the final say in this piece?
I think what it really comes down to, and it's funny because like you talk about education, even like Washington State right now, we're having a lot of discussions as school districts on like, how are we going to do grades? Because OSPI, the Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction, has said, we have a few guidelines, but other than that, you're kind of free to make your own decisions. And so like it's kind of another example of that Federalists, like they're giving individual counties or school districts the power to make decisions on what they want to do for their communities, because like what's good for King County might not be good for what's good for the Quincy School District, or what Wenatchee does might not be good for Quincy. And so, it's interesting that we have that play, but the way that the higher levels always kind of get the lower level to come around is funding. So like you think about what's the legal drinking age in every state in the United States? It's 21. And the way that was done is that the federal government said, well, we have highway money. And if you would like us to give you a grant for highway money, you need to make sure that the drinking age is 21. Magically, everybody, raised the drinking age to 21. And so like the same thing, like I was looking it up just before we came on, because it's like, who pays the county sheriff? Like they say we elect them, the people of our, like in Grant County, we're both Grant County residents. We elect the Grant County sheriff, but does he get paid strictly from Grant County funds? And the answer is no. Right? County sheriffs get a lot of funding from the state. And so if Franklin County or Grant County, Snohomish, Klickitat, whoever, if the sheriff says, I'm not going to follow, I'm going to use my interposition or my, I don't believe that law is constitutional. One, I have a problem with that because as the law enforcement branch, your job is to enforce the law, not to interpret whether it's constitutional or not. And the proper way to deal with that is to send it through the courts.
Yeah.
And so...
And one of the things, sorry to interrupt, one of the things that's really big about that is the county sheriff would be somebody who would actually have standing in court. Residents coming out and doing this would be very interesting to see if the courts would take it on, because that was one of the things I found super interesting when I've been listening to these law podcasts, is that there are some times where the court will say, no, you're the wrong person to bring this up. Like you shouldn't be bringing this up. And just to add to that court case that Barker's talking about is South Dakota versus Dole in 1987. And that was basically the federal law said that they would withhold 5% of the state highway funds if it didn't raise the minimum age to 21. And it was actually ruled constitutional because the Supreme Court ruled that it was reasonable and it was in the general interest of the population of the United States and the state for that matter. So continue, sorry.
But it all goes into your interpretation of Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution in the, what is it? The necessary and proper clause.
Elastic, yeah.
Yeah, the elastic clause. Like, is it necessary? Because it says that the federal government can essentially do things necessary and proper to like running and the well-being of the country.
Right.
And some of these people that say, no, the sheriff has, the final say, would say, no, it's only the enumerated powers. They listed them, that's it. And it really flies in the face of legal precedent for a number of years. And I was listening to one of these speakers, I think it was Richard Mack, who's a former Arizona sheriff, and he was saying, well, if you think the Supreme Court has the right to interpret law, you're wrong. And then he went on to praise Scalia for writing an opinion in his favor. And it's like, but you're okay with him when he has an interpretation that favors you, but you don't like him when he has an interpretation that doesn't favor you. So, I mean, it's just everybody's really pragmatic, and politics are always really tricky that way. But funding is kind of the big thing that's going to, I think, what pulls people around. And that might be what you kind of saw in the background, like that we didn't see as the public, but I'm sure like in Jay Inslee's like letter, or like they know as a county, we get a ton of state funding. And if we're not going to follow the rules, magically, probably some of those things that we could be getting might start drying up. And it might kind of not seem like that's on the level, but like the way that federalism, watching another video, and they said that federalism changes during the New Deal. We go from kind of like being this idea of, you know, instead of being dual federalism, it's what they call it, cooperative federalism, where the states and the federal government had a much friendlier relationship. Like if you think back in the beginning, like Jefferson and like those guys in the Democratic Republican Party like hated the federal government. Like, no, you're too big, you're too tyrannical. Like, let us do what we want. And so like today, the people who really kind of still push that interpretation are like your libertarians and the people that can be considered more to the right, you know, far right, maybe. And that's really outside of the norm of what most people feel politically. And that's always what you see on protests. When you see Antifa or you see like the Proud Boys protesting something, like those are generally the people that don't, the normal Republican isn't the Proud Boys, the normal Democrat is not Antifa. And so it's important that we always remember that the media is going to show us the worst of both sides.
Right.
And kind of like think about what's in the middle. So, and I know Grant County came out, and the county commissioners and the Grant County sheriff came out and said they essentially like wrote a letter saying, our opinion is that we would like things to begin to reopen, please.
Yep.
And then they listed their reasons why, rather than making the demand of saying, I'm not going to do my job because I don't like what you're asking me to do.
Yeah.
Which is school teachers, you know, that happens to us all the time. We've got to enforce tardies. We've got to enforce dress code, right? Do I really want to spend 20 minutes of my day, you know, like checking whether kids, you know, the length of a skirt or where the holes are in your jeans, or if you have, you know, compression shorts underneath. And it's like, no, I don't want to, that's not my job. Right. But like, I can't go up to my principal and be like, I'm not going to do that.
Right.
Right. Because then I'm not being a public servant like I'm supposed to.
Right.
Right. We've got to do similarly, like there's things that we have to do, like teach online, even though some of us don't like it. We obviously do. We're comfortable.
Yeah. I mean, we're having fun with it. So life gives you lemons, you make lemonade. One of the things that I found interesting though, like, because when I was looking at this, I said, okay, a lot of my court cases and stuff that I analyzed for when we talked about federalism had to do with Congress making laws, right? And this isn't congressional law, obviously. Like, this is executive order. So, right, the executive is using their executive authority in a time of emergency to declare, you know, some sort of power. And so the one court case that this matches with is Executive Order 9066, I believe. Yeah. And that became a court case in the Supreme Court called Korematsu versus the United States. And it was actually a Japanese man suing the federal government, saying that law or that executive order is unconstitutional. And the Supreme Court upheld the law. But what was interesting was, and again, this is from that law professor in Nebraska, was he basically said that the court looked at it and said, okay, we shouldn't overrule an elected official, right? Because the president is an elected official, right? So we shouldn't, if we don't think something's right, we shouldn't also say, you know, and they the more we see in court now is the more, like, whenever there's like a question, when it's close, the court always tries to lean towards the elected officials, right? People elected them, da-da-da-da. And so they said that, and then they said that in a time of war, that is a time of emergency, and if the military is recommending this, then the president can't look away from what the military needs during a time of war. Obviously, a completely different situation, right? We're not comparing it, but I found it interesting because that was the only one I could find on an executive order, right, to try and challenge constitutionally. There's
a similar one. There was a student, a Japanese American student at the University of Washington, Gordon Hirabayashi. Sorry if I didn't get that out completely perfectly. But there was a curfew. This was prior, I believe, to 966. But it was only for like people of, like, you know, Asian descent.
Yeah.
And so he sat there. He was at the University of Washington in the library going, like, why do I have to go home right now? Why can't, and this is before the internet, right? Mind you, so like he can't go home and study. Like the materials he needs are in the library. So he's at an academic disadvantage because of his ethnicity. And again, I think he lost his court case when it was tried during that time. And then they later probably, I think they came back and were like, whoops, just like with Korematsu. I had the privilege of listening to his daughter talk from the Korematsu Institute at the end of last year. And they were talking about how, they went to court and they did lose. And then eventually the government kind of came back and said, yeah, like we did, and that's what the sad thing is. It's like, it's all in hindsight.
Yep.
But I mean, like, if you take those with a grain of salt, like it's one of the things that we always talk about with freedom. It's America's a mixture of liberty and freedom and safety.
Yep.
True freedom is anarchy. I can do whatever I want. I can go burn down my neighbor's house because that's what I feel like doing. But that doesn't make my neighbors feel very safe.
Right.
And so there's always this kind of balancing act between what's good for the individual and what's good for the whole. I mean, we're not North Korea, as much as people want to just be really pragmatic or really hyperbolic and be like, oh, if you take away anything, like, like there's a lot of people calling people Nazis right now, which just completely defeats any kind of conversation, because that is such a charged term that people just shut down. Either they don't take you seriously or they get really offended, and then you just start screaming at each other, and you really lack the ability to have a conversation about what the actual issues are at hand.
Yeah, and that's really important. We stress this all the time, and it's harder with Barker and I because obviously we tend to have the same leanings politically and share a lot of our ideas, even though we'll disagree about minor things, but not major. So, but like one of the things that we pride ourselves on is being able to have a conversation with somebody and who thinks differently. And I think it's Aristotle who says the famous quote is, the mark of an educated mind is to entertain an idea without accepting it. And I think that's like a really big thing. And we would say, like, in our society, it's something that's so important that we need. So again, federalism, like we don't have an answer for you. That's part of the fun of our shenanigans is, the answer we have at the moment is the person with the purse strings or the money is able to negotiate anytime somebody doesn't want to do their job or feels that a law is unconstitutional. Let me rephrase that because that was inappropriate. So that people feel like if they feel like something's unconstitutional and they stand up for it and that's their belief, the person with the money usually can, negotiate something back on track. So
well, and it's usually the higher level of government usually wins.
Yep.
Not always. You look at U.S. or was it Prince versus the U.S. where they tried to get sheriffs to enforce the Brady Bill without any funding, and they threatened to throw them in jail. They actually took that to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled that no, they can't they can't force local law enforcement to enforce federal policy, which is the same reason why like local law enforcement doesn't have to detain illegal immigrants or undocumented immigrants for ICE, because ICE is a federal program where local law enforcement is not federal, so they don't have to do their job.
Correct. So, but yeah, it's interesting topic to talk about. It's interesting thing. These are the things that Barker and I get to talk about when we get to have Zoom meetings with our history department, or we get to have our pre-meetings before these shows. So, fun stuff next week. So 8th graders, if you're watching, we're going to make the switch from, we finished up our first round of Washington establishing government. We're going to jump now to Manifest Destiny, which is super fun. Yep. It's going to be a great, super excited. So we'll start talking Manifest Destiny next week. Our shenanigans. We're super excited about our shenanigans next week. We will record an episode because the United States Navy just released footage of UFOs. So we are going to cover the history of UFOs. So stay tuned for that one. Until anything else to add? Sorry.
Do you believe?
Yeah. Hashtag do you believe? Until next time, I'm Turn.
I'm Bark.
And we're going to be here a long time. Have a good night, everybody.
Be safe.
And be well.